At the most exclusive galas in New York, one woman stands apart. She is Amanda Burden, the visionary urban planner who helped lead New York's post-9/11 rebuilding and who gave the world the High Line. But as she passes, the most powerful people in the room still whisper, they don't see the planner, they see the ghost. That's her, they say. That's Babe Paley's daughter. That name is a story in itself, a story of impossible beauty, of a perfect life that was a lie, and of a devastating public betrayal by Truman Capote that burned an entire generation of high society to the ground. This is not the story of those socialite ashes. This is the story of what rose from them. Amanda Burden inherited a world defined by secrets, surfaces, and a famous public humiliation. She was born in a gilded cage, expected to be nothing but beautiful. But when her city faced its own, more literal tragedy, the smoking ashes of 9/11, she was the one who stepped in to rebuild. This is the story of the swan who refused to be a decoration, the woman who took the name that was her prison and turned it into the power that reshaped the New York skyline. The tragedy of Amanda Burden's life and her ultimate quiet triumph is impossible to grasp without first descending into the world she was born into. It was a world that no longer exists, a hermetically sealed mid-century universe of almost unimaginable wealth, paralyzing privilege, and a cruelty so profound it was almost an art form. This was the world of her mother, Barbara Babe Paley. To say Babe Paley was beautiful is to miss the point. It's like saying the sun is warm. She was not just a beautiful woman, she was the living, breathing, undisputed archetype of beauty for her time. She was voted the best-dressed woman in the world 14 times, an unbroken streak, until she was finally, mercifully, retired to the Hall of Fame to give someone else a chance. She was the original and the ultimate swan, the flock of impossibly elegant, rail-thin, and fabulously wealthy society women who revolved like adoring planets around the brilliant, bitchy, and dangerous sun of the writer Truman Capote. But even among the other swans, Slim Keith, Gloria Guinness, C.Z. Guest, Babe was the queen. She was the one they all, secretly or openly, aspired to be. Her life was a performance of such total, obsessive perfection that it defied belief. Friends would recall that Babe Paley never had a hair out of place, not just in public, ever. She was, as Capote himself, the man who would destroy her, once wrote, perfect. She was the most perfect creature. She never made a wrong move. She was a woman who, if she had a single stray eyelash on her cheek, would appear in the "What's Wrong with This Picture" column of a magazine. The psychological pressure of this was immense. A friend recalled visiting Babe in the hospital after a serious invasive surgery. Babe was lying in her bed, looking pale, fragile, and human. The friend looked away for a moment to speak to a nurse, and when she looked back, Babe had in that split second managed to grab her compact, apply lipstick, and pinch her cheeks to create a healthy flush. She could not, even on the verge of unconsciousness, bear to be seen as imperfect. This obsessive perfection was not vanity, it was a job. It was the armor she wore to survive the man she married, William S. Paley. Bill Paley was not just a husband, he was an emperor. He was the founder of CBS, a media titan who had clawed his way up from a family of Chicago cigar makers to build a global broadcasting empire. He was brilliant, he was ruthless, he was charismatic, and he was, by all accounts, monstrous. He was a serial philanderer of almost pathological proportions. He did not just have affairs, he had a relentless, grinding, and humiliating conveyor belt of mistresses, which he paraded in front of his wife and her friends with a casual, almost sociopathic cruelty. He was a man who, as the stories go, could be in another room of the hospital with another woman, even while Babe was in the next room with her newborn. That was the kind of casual cruelty she learned to survive. Babe's job, her only job, was to be the perfect wife. And in this world, perfect did not mean loved. It meant flawless. Her perfection was her only defense. She could not control his fidelity, but she could, with an iron, unforgiving will, control everything else. She could control the flowers, the menus, the guest lists, the clothes, the furniture, and, most of all, herself. Their homes, the staggering Fifth Avenue apartment, the 80-acre Kiluna estate on Long Island, were not homes. They were sets. They were curated, priceless stage pieces for the performance of their lives. A friend once noted that Babe's flower arrangements were so perfect, so art-directed, that you were almost afraid to breathe near them for fear a petal might fall and ruin the illusion. And this performance had one other crucial cast member, the court jester, the confidant, the man who knew all the secrets, Truman Capote. Capote in the 1960s was on top of the world. He had published in cold blood and was the most famous writer in America. He was Babe's other husband, her non-sexual best friend. He was her shadow, her little man, her constant companion on Onassis's yacht and on the Agnelli private jet, and at the endless daily lunches at La Côte Basque. She adored him. He was the one person she could, she thought, be imperfect with. He was the one person she could laugh with, the one person she could confide in about the crushing existential misery of her perfect life. She told him everything. She told him about Bill's infidelities, about the emptiness, about the secrets of her swan friends. And he in turn listened, soothed, and like a magpie, collected every single glittering, toxic secret. This was the world Amanda Burden was born into in 1944. It was not a home. It was a museum. It was not a family. It was a cast of characters, all of them fragile, all of them performing. Amanda and her younger brother, Bill Jr., were not children. They were accessories. They were, as one biographer noted, human props to be brought out, perfectly dressed and scrubbed, to be presented to guests and then quietly sent back to the nursery. Amanda would later recall the suffocating coldness of it all. Her mother, she said, was a figure of speech more than a figure of comfort. She remembered her mother not as a physical presence, but as a scent, a vision of elegance gliding down a hallway in a main-bochet gown. She was a woman who had her hair and makeup professionally done before coming into the nursery to say goodnight to her own children. This was not a world that bred warmth or intimacy. It bred, in Amanda, a desperate, quiet, and profound need to escape. But that escape would have to wait. Before she could run, she first had to perform the role she was born into. The world of the Swans was, above all, a marriage market, and Amanda, as Babe Paley's daughter, was its most prized and most scrutinized debutante. She was now a young woman, and the cold performative world of her childhood nursery was about to expand into the cold performative world of New York society, where the pressures to conform, to be beautiful, and to secure a husband would become her entire existence. Growing up as the daughter of Babe Paley was, for a young girl, a specific kind of psychological torture. Amanda was not, by the impossible airbrushed standards of her mother's world, a classic beauty. Her mother was all effortless, ethereal grace, a woman who, with the turn of her head, could silence a room. Amanda was different. She was awkward. She was tall. She was serious. And she was, and this was the word that defined her childhood, intelligent. In the world of the Swans, this was not a compliment. It was a complication. Beauty was the only currency that mattered. Intellect in a woman was secondary, even a burden. It was something to be hidden, like a blemish. Amanda learned very young that she could never, ever compete with her mother on her mother's terms. She could not be Babe Paley. The pressure to try, however, was relentless. She was sent to the finest schools, the Greenvale School, then the prestigious Westover School in Connecticut. She was trained in the arts of the socialite, how to walk, how to talk, how to dress, how to be. She was being groomed with the precision of a racehorse for the only job available to her, to be the next Mrs. Somebody, to make a brilliant dynastic marriage, and to replicate her mother's perfect, hollow life. But the seed of rebellion was already there. She was her father's daughter, too. She had his intellect, his drive, his ambition. But in a girl, these qualities were to be suppressed, polished into a charming but harmless shine. She was in effect a thoroughbred racehorse being trained to be a decorative pony, one to be paraded around a ring. The internal conflict, the sense of a life misspent, of a mind being wasted, must have been suffocating. So she made her first attempt at escape, but it was not an escape at all. It was a lateral move. It was the only move she had been taught to make. In 1964, at the age of 20, she did exactly what was expected of her. She made a brilliant marriage. The man was Carter Burden Jr., and he was in every way the perfect match. He was everything Bill Paley was not, at least on the surface. He was not new money. He was aristocracy. He was a Vanderbilt descendant, a man whose bloodline was a roadmap of New York's Gilded Age. He was handsome. He was brilliant. He was intellectual. He was a Harvard graduate on his way to Columbia Law School. He was, in short, the most eligible, most establishment man of his generation. Their wedding was the society event of the year, a merger of two great American dynasties, the new, powerful, and slightly vulgar media money of the Paleys, and the old aristocratic Knickerbocker blood of the Burdens. Amanda, at 20, was now Mrs. Carter Burden. She had fulfilled her destiny, and for a time she played the part, just as her mother had. Carter, after a brief bored stint in law, decided to go into politics. He was a Kennedy liberal, a progressive anti-war Democrat, and Amanda became the perfect political wife. She was young, she was elegant, and she was, like her mother, a flawless hostess. Their magnificent art-filled apartment at 1025th Avenue became a salon, a gathering place for the brightest, most glamorous minds of the era, writers, artists, politicians. Norman Mailer, Andy Warhol, Robert F. Kennedy, they all came. Amanda, the young, serious hostess, was the quiet, graceful presence at the center of it all, the hostess who made sure every glass was full and every conversation sparkling. She was, in effect, Babe Paley 2.0, but with a crucial intellectual difference. Her parties weren't just about being seen. They were about discussing things. But it was still a performance. It was still his world. She was still an accessory, an elegant wife. She had 2 children, a son, Carter Burden III, and a daughter, Flobell. She was a mother, she was a wife, she was a hostess. Her life was, on paper, a perfect, unadulterated success. But inside, that old familiar emptiness, the Paley inheritance, was creeping in. This was not her life. It was a role, and it was a role she was beginning to find just as suffocating as her mother's. The marriage, which had begun with such promise, was fracturing. Carter's political ambitions, his own restless energy, and the pressures of their hyper-public world were pulling them apart. And then one day in the late 1960s came the click, the untold story that would change everything. It was not a grand public event. It was a quiet, private moment of revelation, a moment of true and final escape. She was visiting the ruins of the 1964 World's Fair in Queens. The fair, once a glittering symbol of futuristic optimism, was now a decaying, post-apocalyptic landscape of crumbling pavilions and rusting skeletons. It was desolate. It was ugly. It was a graveyard of dreams. And Amanda, the society hostess, standing in the middle of this urban decay, felt something. She felt a profound sense of sadness, not for the past, but for the waste. She saw the land, she saw the space, and she saw with a sudden, shocking clarity what it could be. In that moment, she realized her passion was not for politics, not for art, not for fashion. It was for place. It was for the city. It was for the physical, tangible, and often broken world that people lived in. She realized, as she would later say, that the built environment has a profound effect on people's lives. This was her eureka moment. This was the key turning. This was the discovery of a world that was the exact polar opposite of her mother's. Babe's world was about facades. It was about interior decoration, about the inside of things, about creating a perfect, private, exclusive illusion. Amanda had just discovered the outside, the public, the real, the messy, broken, and deeply democratic world of the city street. The decision was, in her social circle, a nuclear bomb. In 1972, at the age of 28, Amanda Burden, mother of two, wife of Carter Burden, heiress to the Paley fortune, a woman who was supposed to be at lunch at La Grenouille, did the unthinkable. She divorced her husband, and she enrolled as a graduate student at the Columbia University School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. This was the real rebellion. This was not a ladies' charity, a pet project. This was work. This was a difficult, male-dominated, intensely academic field. It was a world of zoning laws, of demographic studies, of concrete and steel. It was, in the eyes of her mother's world, bizarre. It was unglamorous. It was dirty. And it was, for Amanda, the first breath of real, fresh air in her entire life. The perfect wife was gone. Amanda Burden, student, was born. She was now 28 years old, a single mother, and for the first time she had a purpose. She was finally, truly escaping. And then, just as she was building her new life, the old one came back to destroy her mother. This was her declaration of independence, a quiet, personal revolution. Amanda had divorced her husband, traded Fifth Avenue for a university library, and had begun the long, slow process of building a life of her own. But just as she was taking her first tentative steps into the real world, the illusory world she had just fled, the world of her mother, of secrets and surfaces, was about to be blown apart in the most public and violent way imaginable by the one man who knew where all the bodies were buried. Amanda was in her new world. She was at Columbia, a 30-year-old student among 20-year-olds, a socialite in a world of academics, a woman in a sea of men. She was learning, she was struggling, she was, for the first time, anonymous. And it was at this exact moment in 1975 that the atom bomb that had been ticking under her mother's life finally exploded. Truman Capote, desperate to recapture his literary glory, his well of creativity long since dry, published a chapter from his long-awaited, never-finished novel, Answered Prayers, in Esquire magazine. The chapter was called La Côte Basque, 1965. It was not fiction. It was a betrayal of such breathtaking, intimate, and surgical cruelty that it is still shocking to read today. It was, quite simply, a transcript of every secret Babe Paley and her friends had ever told him, barely disguised, laid bare for the entire world to read. He exposed the affairs, the sexual perversions, the insecurities, the murders, and the heartbreaks of the women who had trusted him completely. And his portrait of Cleo Dillon, the character based on his beloved Babe, was the most brutal and the most unforgivable of all. He told the world about her husband, Sidney Dillon. He told the world about his grotesque, constant affairs. And then he published the story, the one unforgivable, intimate secret. He described how Sidney Dillon had an affair with the wife of a prominent governor, and how in a moment of passion, the woman had left a messy menstrual stain on the pristine sheets of their guest bed. He then described how Cleo Babe, upon discovering it, was not angry, but resigned, and how when her husband later complained about the woman, Babe had simply and coldly said, "What did you expect? She's a prostitute." With that single anecdote, Capote had done the unforgivable. He hadn't just exposed Bill Paley's infidelity, he had exposed Babe's knowledge of it. He had exposed her humiliation, her pain, and the cold, desperate defense mechanism she had built to survive it. He had, in effect, told the world that her entire perfect life, the performance she had dedicated every waking moment to, was a complete and total fraud. The fallout was absolute. The Swans were destroyed. Anne Woodward, the socialite whose scandal was thinly fictionalized in Capote's piece, took her own life shortly before the article appeared. And Babe Paley, she was broken. She never, ever spoke to Truman Capote again. When his name was mentioned, she would simply go cold, stare into the middle distance, and change the subject. The man who had been her lifeline, her other husband, had, for the sake of a story, murdered her. For Amanda, watching this from the sidelines of her new life at Columbia, it was the ultimate, horrifying confirmation. She had made the right choice. Her mother's world, the world she had just escaped, was not just frivolous, it was lethal. It was a world that built women into goddesses, and then, when they were no longer useful, fed them to the wolves. Babe's death came just 3 years later in 1978. She died at 63 from lung cancer. She had been a chain smoker, a habit of the perfect, rail-thin socialite. Her death was slow, agonizing, and lonely. Bill Paley, true to form, was barely present. He was, as he had always been, busy with other women, other deals. Amanda and her siblings watched their mother, the most beautiful woman in the world, waste away. When Babe Paley died, the world of the Swans died with her. The era was over. The performance was finished. And for Amanda, then 34 years old, the cage at last was open. She was free. She was a graduate of Columbia University, and she was an heiress to the ashes of a vast, glittering, and deeply poisoned legacy. The question was, what on earth would she do with it? The answer to that question would define the rest of her life. The world of the Swans was dead, and Amanda was, in effect, an orphan of that glittering, poisoned era. She could have retreated, becoming a permanent lady who lunches, a tragic heiress defined by her mother's fame and her mother's betrayals. Instead, she chose to answer the question, not with parties, but with work. The escape was complete, but freedom was just the beginning. Now she had to build an identity, not from an inheritance, but from the ground up, in the mud and concrete of a city that was, itself, on the verge of collapse. For a woman who had never had to work a day in her life, a woman who had been trained from birth for a life of managed leisure, the transition was brutal, and it was exactly what she needed. The next decade of Amanda Burden's life is the most crucial, the most formative, and the least discussed. These were her wilderness years. This was the long, unglamorous apprenticeship where she shed the skin of Babe's daughter and Carter's wife and earned, through sheer, grinding, anonymous effort, a new name, Amanda M. Burden, PPAICP. She was not, as one might assume, fast-tracked to the top. Her name in this new world was a liability, not an asset. She was a curiosity, a socialite, dabbling in a serious profession. She earned her master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University in the early 1970s and took a job at the New York City Urban Development Corporation. This was not a prestige job. This was a gritty, bureaucratic, thankless job, deep in the weeds of public policy, in a city that was at the time on the verge of bankruptcy. This was the New York of taxi driver, a city of decay, of crime, of financial ruin. And here was Amanda Burden, the Paley heiress, trying to figure out housing policy. And then she found her true mentor. He was not a fashion designer or a society columnist. He was a man named Richard Cahan, the hard-charging, brilliant, and famously difficult head of the Battery Park City Authority. This was, at the time, the single most ambitious urban project in America. The plan was staggering: to build an entire new 92-acre neighborhood from scratch on a massive barren landfill in the Hudson River. This landfill had been created from the millions of cubic yards of rock and earth excavated from the construction of the original World Trade Center. It was a blank, windswept canvas of dirt. Cahan, a legend in the world of public development, was tasked with turning this patch of nothing into a world-class community. He needed a team, and Amanda Burden, with her new degree, applied. Cahan, by his own account, was deeply skeptical. He saw her name, her pedigree, and he thought, as everyone did, that she was a socialite, a dilettante, a lady who lunches. He assumed she was bored, looking for a hobby. He decided to give her a test, a fool's errand, designed to make her quit. He gave her a complex, mind-numbing, and politically toxic zoning dispute to solve. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, a problem no one else wanted to touch. He expected her to fail, to get bored, to disappear back to her Fifth Avenue life. Instead, she returned to his office a short time later with a perfectly analyzed, meticulously researched, and brilliantly solved solution. She had not just read the reports, she had understood them. She had not just made calls, she had navigated the political minefield. Cahan was stunned. He realized in that moment that she was not a Paley. She was a worker. She was, he would later say, the hardest working person I have ever met. Cahan did more than hire her. He unleashed her. For the next 10 years, Amanda Burden poured her suppressed intellect and obsessive focus into this 92-acre blank slate. And in doing so, she found not just a career, but a psychoanalysis. This patch of dirt was, in every conceivable way, the antidote to the world of Babe Paley. Her mother's world was old, finished, fragile, and suffocating. It was a world of inherited objects, of priceless antiques, of rooms so perfect. They were, in effect, already dead. Battery Park City was new. It was raw, it was dirty, it was pure, unadulterated potential. It was the first place in her life where the name Babe Paley's daughter had absolutely no currency. On a windswept pile of landfill, no one cared about your pedigree. They only cared if you could build. And it was here that she waged her first quiet wars. The original plan, drawn up by a committee of famous ego-driven male architects, was exactly what one would expect. A cold, modernist, Corbusian vision of isolated towers, monumental plazas, and vast windswept spaces. It was an architecture of alienation. Amanda, the apprentice, hated it. She argued, she fought, she used her meticulous research and her emerging iron-willed authority to argue for something else, something human. She fought for streets, she fought for a grid that felt like a traditional New York neighborhood, for storefronts that engaged the sidewalk, for a scale that made a human being feel welcome, not dwarfed. And most importantly, she fought for the Esplanade. This, her first great public space, was a declaration of her entire philosophy. It was the anti-Robert Moses. It was not a highway to rush through. It was a path designed for the stroll. It was a space that forced you to slow down, to look at the water, to interact with another human being. And it was here that she found her trademark. Her mother's world was defined by the chaise lounge, an object of private aristocratic leisure. Amanda's world would be defined by the park bench. This was her rebellion, fought with granite and wood. The furniture in her childhood home was a barrier, an artifact to be admired from a distance. The benches she fought for were an invitation. They were a democratic object designed to be used by a banker, by a nanny, by a tourist. They were, in her own quiet way, the ultimate rejection of the look-don't-touch coldness that had defined her entire childhood. She was succeeding. She was earning a reputation not as a socialite, but as a serious, effective, and formidably intelligent planner. She was, in this tough, unglamorous world, finally becoming herself. But her personal life, the one she had tried to build after her divorce, was about to bring her a new, unexpected joy, and in time, a new, profound, and defining tragedy. She had, in this brutal, male-dominated world, proven herself. She had built a formidable professional identity, a suit of armor forged in zoning battles and bureaucratic grit. But the other half of her life, the personal half, the part of her defined by her mother's tragic marriage and her own perfect starter marriage, was still unresolved. She had escaped her mother's life, but to be truly free, she would have to find a way to escape her father's shadow. She needed a partner who was not a cold, aristocratic echo of the past, but a force of nature like her. In 1981, Amanda, now 37, a respected planner and a single mother, married again, and this time her choice was in every way a repair of her past. He was, in a sense, the man her father, Bill Paley, had always pretended to be. His name was Stephen J. Ross. Steve Ross was the anti-Paley. Like Bill Paley, he was a self-made Jewish mogul, a titan of the new media landscape. He was the visionary founder of Warner Communications, the man who was building the empire that would one day become Time Warner. He was, like Paley, phenomenally wealthy, powerful, and charismatic. He was, in every sense of the word, the king of New York. But there, the comparison ended. Where Bill Paley was cold, cruel, narcissistic, and vain, Steve Ross was warm. He was adored. He was famous, legendary, for his emotional intelligence, his staggering, almost reckless generosity, his genuine, almost fatherly love for the people who worked for him. He was a man who, when he met Steven Spielberg, then an unknown young director, gave him his first contract based on a handshake and then treated him like a son for the rest of his life. He was a man who, in the brutal, shark-infested waters of corporate America, was known simply as a good man. His philosophy was not me first, it was we. For Amanda, a woman whose entire concept of father and husband had been defined by the cold, transactional narcissism of Bill Paley and the aristocratic intellectual coolness of Carter Burden, Steve Ross was a revelation. This was what love, what partnership, was supposed to feel like. It was a marriage of equals. He was not threatened by her intelligence. He was captivated by it. He didn't see her as an accessory. He saw her as a partner. He adored her, and he championed her work. He was, in effect, the anti-Carter Burden as well. He wasn't a fellow aristocrat. He was a passionate, loud, and brilliant force of nature who saw her, not her pedigree. Their life together was, by all accounts, a period of profound happiness and stability for Amanda. They were a true power couple at the absolute nexus of media, culture, and finance in the 1980s New York. But it was a private happiness. Amanda, now in her 40s, was a formidable professional. She was no longer a socialite on the party pages. She was a boss at Battery Park City. She was still working, still building, still fighting for her benches and her parks. She had found a partner who celebrated her strength rather than just her beauty. And then, just as she had finally built a life of personal and professional stability, a life that was finally, truly her own. The Paley curse of tragedy, the shadow that had defined her mother's life, struck again. In 1992, Steve Ross died. His death from prostate cancer was shockingly fast. He was only 65. Amanda, at 48, was a widow. This was a different kind of grief. This was not the complicated, suffocating legacy of her mother's death or the quiet, civil ending of her first marriage. This was the clean, sharp, and agonizing grief of losing a true partner, a man she genuinely adored. But his death also marked a final, crucial turning point in her story. Steve Ross, in his famous generosity, left her a widow of immense, independent wealth. She was no longer just the Paley heiress, a fortune tied up in a complex family trust, controlled by her father's whims. She was on her own, in her own name, one of the wealthiest women in New York. She was now 48 years old. She was a single mother, a widow, a battle-hardened professional with over a decade of experience in the trenches of city government. And she was formidably, independently rich. She was, for the first time in her life, no longer Babe's daughter, no longer Carter's wife, no longer Steve's wife. She was at last, simply, Amanda Burden. And she was about to meet the one man who would give her the power to change the world. She was at last a fully formed person. She was no longer an heiress in training, an apprentice in the trenches, or a wife in the shadow of a great man. She was a master of her craft, a woman of immense personal wealth and unmatched professional experience. She was no longer waiting for a role. She was ready for a kingdom. And in 2001, as her city crumbled in a cloud of ash and grief, the kingdom she was born to rule finally called her name. In the 1990s, Amanda, now in her 50s, was a force in her own right. She had her work. She had her wealth. She had her reputation. She had left the public sector to run the planning division for a major private developer, again, learning the other side of the equation. And she began a relationship with another man who, in many ways, was a synthesis of all the men who had come before. His name was Charlie Rose, the intellectual and later disgraced television host. He was, like her father, a media power player. He was, like her first husband, an establishment intellectual. And he was, like Steve Ross, a partner who admired her as an equal. It was through this world, the overlapping elite circles of New York media, finance, and politics, that she became close to the city's next and most consequential new force, Michael Bloomberg. Bloomberg was another self-made mogul, a man who had built a financial data empire that had made him a billionaire. He was, like Steve Ross, a pragmatist. He was, like Bill Paley, a man of immense, unshakable self-regard. He was an engineer by training, a man who believed in data, in systems, and in results. And in 2001, in the immediate, smoking, and terrified aftermath of the September 11th attacks, he was elected mayor of New York. The city was in ruins, not just physically, at ground zero, but psychologically. It was a city drowning in grief, in fear, and in a profound crisis of confidence. The world was watching, wondering if New York's best days were over. Bloomberg's mandate was simple: rebuild. Not just the 16 acres of ground zero, but the entire idea of New York. He had to prove that the city was not just alive, but that it was the future. And in 2002, he made one of his first and most important appointments. He looked for the best, most experienced, most pragmatic planner he could find. And he found Amanda Burden. He asked her to be his director of the New York City Department of City Planning, and more importantly, chair of the City Planning Commission. This was it. This was the moment her entire strange and difficult life had been leading to. The girl from the gilded cage, the awkward intellectual, the apprentice planner from Battery Park, the widow of Steve Ross, was now, at 58, in charge of the entire physical form and future of the greatest and most wounded city on earth. This is where the ashes of the prompt find their second and most literal meaning. The Trotan of Capote's social world had defined her youth. The literal ashes of the World Trade Center would now define her legacy. But the mandate was a psychological and political impossibility. The 16 acres of Ground Zero were not just a development site. They were a global graveyard. And Amanda, as chair of the Planning Commission, was thrust into the center of a brutal war of conflicting visions. There were, in essence, 3 wars being fought on that sacred ground. First was the war of memory. The families of the victims, shattered by grief, saw the site as hallowed ground. Many wanted nothing built there at all, save for a vast green memorial. To them, any talk of commerce of new towers was a sacrilege. Second was the war of commerce. The developer, Larry Silverstein, who held the lease, was legally and financially bound to rebuild. He needed to restore the 10 million square feet of office space he had lost. His vision was commercial, a fortress of capitalism rebuilt in defiance. Third was the war of ego. The world's most famous architects, Libeskind, Childs, Foster, Calatrava, had descended, each wanting to build the grand, symbolic, career-defining monument that would claim the skyline in the history books. Into this vortex of grief, money, and ego stepped Amanda Burden. And her philosophy was the quietest and perhaps the most radical of all. While the others were fighting over what to build, a tower, a memorial, a museum, Amanda was asking a different question. How do we make this a neighborhood again? This was the ultimate test of her Battery Park City ideals. How do you apply human scale to an event of inhuman tragedy? How do you put a park bench in a wound? She and her team fought not for the tallest spire, but for the life of the street. She argued that if Ground Zero became only a memorial or only an office park, it would be a dead zone, a place the city would encircle but never re-enter. She fought to restore the street grid that the original towers had erased. She fought for retail, for sidewalks, for places where life in its mundane, daily, defiant beauty could return. It was a battle not for the sky, but for the ground. And it was a battle that would define the next decade of her life, a constant grinding negotiation between the monumental and the intimate, the sacred and the profane, the memory of the dead and the needs of the living. For the next 12 years, from 2002 to 2013, Amanda Burden was quite simply the most powerful woman in New York. Working in unusually close alignment with Mayor Michael Bloomberg, she became part of the core team that drove the city's rebirth, and her vision was radical. It was not a vision of grand singular monuments. It was not the starchitect vision of a new glittering tower. Her vision, honed over decades in the trenches, was the exact opposite. It was a vision of the street. It was a vision, as she would say in her famous TED Talk, that a city's public life is in its public spaces. She was not just a planner, she was a social engineer, a woman who believed that a well-designed city could, quite literally, make people happier, make them feel less alone, make them feel part of something. And she set to work with the iron-willed, obsessive focus of her mother. But where Babe Paley had applied that genius to a floral arrangement or a place setting, Amanda applied it to the thousands of blocks that make up New York City. She was famously, almost comically, obsessive. She would, as her colleagues recalled, spend hours debating the design of a single park bench. The bench, she argued, is the key. It must be comfortable. It must have a back. It must have armrests so you can read a newspaper or so 2 people don't have to touch. She would test them herself, sitting, reading, and most importantly, feeling. This was the goddess of small things at work, and her philosophy would, piece by piece, reshape the city. She led the charge to reclaim New York's post-industrial waterfront, a project that resulted in 86 miles of new public open space. She pushed through the creation of dozens of new public plazas, turning forgotten scraps of concrete into vibrant social hubs. She changed the zoning laws to force developers to build active street fronts, requiring shops in glass, not dead granite walls. And then came her crowning achievement, the one that would make her a global icon, the High Line. It was, at the time, a crazy idea. It was a 1.5-mile-long elevated and abandoned freight railway, a rusting, weed-choked eyesore that sliced through the west side of Chelsea. The city under Mayor Giuliani wanted to tear it down. The developers wanted to tear it down. It was an ugly, useless piece of urban decay. But Amanda saw what she had seen in the ruins of the World's Fair 30 years earlier. She saw not what it was, but what it could be. She championed it. She fought for it. She held the design competition. And she pushed it through, using her political capital, her design savvy, and her unique ability to stare down billionaire developers and win. The result was a masterpiece, a park in the sky, a thin green ribbon of such innovative, startling beauty that it became an instant global landmark. It was the ultimate symbol of her entire philosophy, the redemption of a forgotten, ugly, industrial piece of infrastructure, turned into a thing of pure, democratic, public joy. It was, in effect, the physical manifestation of her own life story. But the story of how it happened is the real miracle and the ultimate case study of Amanda's new synthesized power. The High Line was not her idea. It was the crazy obsession of two men, Joshua David and Robert Hammond, two local residents with no money and no power who just thought the rusting relic was beautiful. They were seen as romantics, as dreamers, as nuisances. The entire city establishment was against them. The previous mayor, Rudy Giuliani, had already signed the demolition orders. The local property owners, the powerful Chelsea real estate barons, loathed it. They saw it as an eyesore, a blight that blocked views and lowered their property values. They wanted it torn down yesterday. This is where Amanda Burden entered. She was the one critical person inside the government who did not laugh at the crazy idea. She, the woman who had seen the potential in the ruins of the World's Fair, saw this not as a problem, but as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She became its internal champion. And she deployed a tactic of pure political and economic genius, a move she had perfected at Battery Park City. She didn't just fight the developers, she used them. Her team engineered a brilliant piece of incentive zoning. She told the developers, "You want to tear this down? Number. Instead, we are going to make this railway a public park, which will make your properties impossibly valuable. And in exchange for that new value, you will help pay for it." She created a complex transferable air rights program, allowing developers near the High Line to build taller than they were legally allowed in exchange for massive contributions to the park's construction and maintenance fund. This was the Paley Burden synthesis in its purest form. She used the raw capitalist greed of the developers to finance a beautiful, progressive public good. It was a masterstroke, a political and financial jujitsu move that turned her most powerful enemies into her primary source of funding and cemented her status as a legend. The High Line made Amanda Burden a global icon. It was the perfect story. A beautiful, elegant, aristocratic woman who, through sheer force of will and exquisite taste, had given the public a park of impossible beauty. It was a triumph, a perfect redemptive third act. But this is New York, and in a city of 8 million stories, nothing is ever that simple. The goddess of small things was also the queen of massive, controversial, and transformative change, and for every person who saw her as a savior, there was another who saw her as the very symbol of their displacement. But this is not a fairy tale, and Amanda Burden's 12-year reign as the Queen of New York was not a simple benevolent dictatorship of good taste. Her vision of a beautiful, accessible, and perfectly designed city came at a staggering, and some would say devastating cost. This is where the simple, heroic narrative fractures. This is where the ghost of her past, the ghost of her 1% upbringing, returns not as a whisper, but as a furious, credible, and defining accusation. To build her new New York, Amanda didn't just build parks, she rezoned. She and the Bloomberg administration rezoned in their 12 years an astonishing 40% of the entire city. 124 separate neighborhoods. This was a colossal tectonic shift, an act of social and economic engineering on a scale never before seen in American history. And this is where the historical arguments of her legacy are fought. The criticism is this: Amanda Burden, the daughter of Babe Paley, who through marriage into the Burden, used her immense power not to create a democratic city, but to create a new, glittering, and ruthlessly exclusive playground for her own class. It started with the rezonings of entire neighborhoods, like Williamsburg and Greenpoint in Brooklyn. These were vast post-industrial working-class areas, home to artists, immigrants, and longtime residents. Amanda's new zoning plan unlocked the waterfront, paving the way for massive luxury residential development, and the developers, predictably, came in a flood. The old gritty, authentic waterfront was transformed almost overnight into a wall of glittering glass towers. The result was a tidal wave of gentrification, of displacement, of soaring unimaginable rents that pushed out the very artists, immigrants, and working-class families that had made the neighborhoods vibrant in the first place. The goddess of small things had, in the eyes of her critics, unleashed a monster of displacement. And then there was Billionaire's Row. This was perhaps the most controversial and most symbolic single act of her tenure. It was a small, almost surgical zoning change on and around 57th Street in Midtown Manhattan. It was a complex tweak, one that allowed for the creation of a new, bizarre breed of super tall and super skinny skyscrapers. These were buildings that existed for no other purpose than to sell $100 million apartments to Russian oligarchs, Saudi princes, and secretive hedge fund billionaires. These were not homes. They were safety deposit boxes in the sky. These towers, which cast mile-long shadows over Central Park, became the ultimate glaring symbol of the city's new, profound, and sickening inequality. And Amanda Burden, the woman who fought for the perfect Democratic bench, had been the one to sign the papers. How could one person be responsible for both the High Line and this? The criticism culminated in the brutal decade-long battle over Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn. This was a mega project, a plan to build a new basketball stadium and a cluster of 16 massive towers, all placed directly on top of a working-class residential neighborhood. This was not a zoning debate. It was a war. On one side was Amanda, the Bloomberg administration, and the developer Bruce Ratner. Their argument was one of progress. They saw a vast, blighted, underused rail yard and promised to turn it into a global destination, a state-of-the-art arena designed by Frank Gehry, thousands of units of affordable housing, new jobs, and a new center of gravity for Brooklyn. On the other side was the community, and their argument was about home. The project was so large that it required the state to use eminent domain, the power to forcibly seize private property. This wasn't just a rail yard, it was people's apartments, their businesses, their lives. To them, Amanda Burden, the goddess of small things, was now the face of a monstrous, state-sponsored land grab, destroying a human-scale neighborhood to hand it over to a billionaire developer. The battle raged in courtrooms, in the press, and in angry, screaming community board meetings where Amanda, with her quiet, aristocratic poise, was branded an enemy of the people. And then there was the shadow. If Atlantic Yards was a loud public brawl, Billionaires' Row was a quiet, insidious, and perhaps more damning betrayal. This wasn't a mega project, it was a loophole, a small technical tweak to zoning laws that allowed developers to buy air rights from neighboring buildings, bundle them, and create ghost-like skeletal towers that pierce the clouds. This, her critics argued, was the ultimate unforgivable irony. These towers cast literal mile-long shadows over Central Park, the city's most democratic public space, but they also cast a psychological shadow over her entire legacy, because these buildings were not homes. They were safety deposit boxes in the sky, $100 million pied-à-terre for a global transient oligarchy, sitting dark and empty for most of the year. This was the ultimate ghost of Babe Paley. This was the exact world Amanda had spent her life fleeing, now made manifest in glass and steel and projected 1,500 feet into the sky. It was the world of Kiluna, the world of the Fifth Avenue set, exclusive, empty, perfect, and profoundly cold. And it had been built under her watch as a result of her zoning. It was the one tragic, glaring symbol of the very elitism she had tried, in all her other work, to undo. This is the great, complex, and unresolved paradox of her career. Is she the hero who gave New York the High Line, or is she the villain who gave it Billionaires' Row? Did she create a more livable city, or did she just create a more expensive one, a beautiful velvet-roped museum that only the super-rich could afford to live in? Her defenders, and there are many, argue that this is a naive, binary, and deeply unfair reading of her work. They argue that she was a pragmatist, not an ideologue. That New York, especially after 9/11, was not a socialist utopia. It was a capitalist city on its knees. Her choice was not development versus no development. The developers were coming no matter what. Her choice was bad, ugly, chaotic development versus good, well-designed, and controlled development. Her supporters argue that she used the only tool she had, the brute force power of private capitalist investment, to extract public good. She was the one who forced those developers, in exchange for their giant towers, to build the affordable housing, to build the new parks, to build the waterfront esplanades, to finance the High Line. She was, in their eyes, a master negotiator, the only person in the city's history who could sit at the table with these billionaire developers, look them in the eye as an equal, and win. This is her true complex legacy. She was, in this sense, using her Paley inheritance, her effortless comfort with power and wealth, as a weapon for the public. She wasn't intimidated. She spoke their language. She could, with her icy, aristocratic poise, tell a developer his multi-billion-dollar project was not good enough and make him fix it. She may be the only person in history who could have done it. A person who possessed in one single elegant frame the aesthetic, obsessive perfectionism of Babe Paley and the raw, deal-making corporate power of Bill Paley. This paradox, then, is her true legacy. Was she the elitist who built a velvet rope around the city, or the pragmatist who used her power to make it beautiful? This complex, unresolved question is the key to understanding her entire life, and to finally solve it, To understand the woman who built the High Line, we must return to the beginning. We must return to the ghost that haunts the gala, the whisper that started it all, the ghost of Babe Paley, which brings us back, finally, to the whisper. She's Babe's daughter. The social world that Truman Capote burned to the ground with his article, The World of Babe Paley, was a world defined by one single, brutal, and all-consuming principle: exclusion. La Côte Basque was a fortress. The Swans were a private club, and Capote was its gatekeeper until he wasn't. The entire point of Babe Paley's life was to create a perfect, impenetrable private facade that no one could get into. It was a world of velvet ropes, of private numbers, of unlisted addresses, of guest lists. It was a world of us versus them. It was a world dedicated to judging and to being judged. It was a world in the end of profound and tragic loneliness. Now look at Amanda Burden's life's work, the High Line, the 86 miles of reclaimed waterfront, the public plazas, her entire career, her entire 12-year reign, her life's obsession has been the exact polar opposite. It has been about inclusion. Her entire philosophy is based on creating beautiful, elegant, and perfectly designed spaces for everyone. For the tourist, for the nanny, for the stockbroker, for the student, for the kid from the Bronx who has never seen the water. Her benches, the ones she obsessed over, were a democratic invitation. They were a sign that said, "You are welcome here. You do belong. Sit, stay. You are a part of the city, and the city is a part of you." This is her quiet, elegant, and devastating revenge. She did not fight her mother's world. She did not engage with the gossip, the betrayal, the whispers. She simply let it die. And then on top of the figurative ashes of that exclusive, private, and miserable world, she built a new one, a world that was public, that was shared, and that was in its own way beautiful. And she did it all while rebuilding her city from its other ashes. In the wake of 9/11, when the city's confidence was shattered, when people were fleeing, her work was the physical, tangible proof of its resurrection. While the world focused on the single, sacred, and empty hole at Ground Zero, Amanda's rezonings, her parks, her plazas, were the hundreds of smaller vital acts of regeneration that brought the city back to life. Her work was a defiant statement, written in steel and granite and grass, that told the world New York was not afraid, that it was not dead, that it was, in fact, open for business and open for life. She is, in the end, undeniably Babe Paley's daughter. She inherited her mother's legendary, almost pathological eye for aesthetics, for detail, for perfection, but where Babe Paley applied that genius to a single, fragile, and ultimately tragic object, herself. Amanda applied that same obsessive, iron-willed genius to the most complex, most resilient, and most public object in the world, the city of New York. She took the poisoned inheritance of the swan, and she taught it to fly in the real world. She is the woman who was born into a world of illusions and who dedicated her entire life to building reality, a reality of steel, of glass, of park benches, and of a city, her city, reborn. The girl who was raised in a museum where she couldn't touch anything grew up to be the woman who built a city that begged to be touched. The whisper that followed her, "She's Babe's daughter," was never an insult. It was, in the end, her secret weapon. It was the source of her unshakable taste and the root of her quiet, lifelong revolution against a world that believed a woman's only value was her beauty. Amanda Burden proved that beauty, when unleashed, could be the most powerful and democratic force of all.